This is what I want to highlight a few points here. First of all, probably the most important point is that over time, these costs are recovered. And I want to stress that whether you're doing a large building or a small building, over time, the energy costs will be recovered, which is good for the long-term owner. It may not be as good for the person whose business model is that they build and then they flip it and get out. But the cost per square foot seem to be pretty pricey. And when you look at the JBG study, and these two didn't know they were doing it, they were doing it independently. They came in at about $16 to $18 a square foot, complying with the IgCC versus the $3 or the $5 per square foot, as you can see. So there was an incremental difference of between $13 to $15 per square foot. Could you go back to the previous slide, please? And Darren Waddell, Mr. Coffey, who's a big proponent of this code cycle as well, came to a very similar conclusion relative to the per square foot cost impacts. This was enough to us to say, wait a second, let's take a pause, let's look at this. Particularly recognizing that the 2015 energy code cycle was in the works. That is actually part of Executive Regulation 4-15, which is now being deferred until we'll be back before you in July, I believe. But we wanted to go back and say, okay, we know that the IECC is going to have a different, it's going to require better performance. And so the overall cost impacts of these other beneficial things that we want to accomplish, the overall economic impact should be less. And we wanted to go back and look at that. Could you go to two more slides? That one. Thank you. So the International Energy Conservation Code, that again is part of what is in ER 4-15, it's going to set the standards for new buildings, additions, and renovations. It addresses the thermal envelope, the doors, the windows, the insulation. It also addresses the lighting systems, heating, and cooling. This code cycle is, our code cycle for this code is every 3 years in the state of Maryland, and the current one we expect to have in place as soon as we possibly can. Some reports say, when you look at the 2012 IECC code cycle report, that the energy efficiency that has been accomplished through that code cycle is a 30% betterment over the 2006 code cycle. We want to continue to see improvement. And the 2015 code cycle is expected to get us much closer to where the 2012 IgCC is, which is what we're looking at. Next slide, please. And so this slide comes from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in conjunction with the Department of Energy. And it projects out what are the 2015 IECC is expected to do for different buildings. And particularly, for example, if you just look at the small office building, you can see that it's projecting about a 10 or 11% improvement in the performance. So we do think that the IECC that is before you all, or will be back before you all in July, will accomplish some of the energy benefits that we're looking through the IgCC. Next slide, please. So what are our next steps? Our next steps are that we want to update the economic analysis with the IECC, the the 2015 IECC in mind, and then come forward with and perhaps looking at additional options as well, perhaps increasing the number of options to raise the level of sensitivity and raise the bar and performance for buildings in what we do propose. We are not looking at the 2015 IgCC at this point in time, and even in a recent discussion with Mr. Coffey, we recognize that the industry is still trying to understand the 2015 IgCC, so it's not really ready to move forward. We do think that there's enough known about the 2012 IgCC. We would like to see it move forward. We'd like to see it move forward in the right way, and we'd like to get a better quantification of the IgCC relative to the new codes that are mandated. That's an overview. I don't know, Mr. Nauman or Mr. Mansouri, do you have anything to add? Okay, thank you. That's our presentation. Thank you.
So when will we see the IgCC at the county council?
So I would be very hopeful because we need to get the economic impact analysis done again. Mr. Coffey has indicated a very clear willingness to work with us, and he's very busy right now, and he did indicate that he'd be willing to work with us as soon as he can, which I would hope would be over the summer. Would be able to get this wrapped up. I'd like to have it for you when you come back. That would be my goal. I don't want to make that promise to you, though, and we also need to deal with JBG as well to see if we can get them to update their analysis. I want to make sure that it makes sense. We definitely want to see it come forward. You do have my commitment to look at it aggressively over the summer and try to have something back to you again, as I said, when you come back in the fall, September timeframe.
Well, I will say that's slightly more responsive than when I asked you the same question in committee. So I am taking away from this that possibly in the fall of 2015 we might act on the 2012 code. Mr. Sheveko has been in touch with me over some period of time on this. He was an active participant in community discussions on the new Green Buildings Code, and it's his turn to address the County Council and share his thoughts on what direction we should be going with respect to the International Green Buildings Construction Code.
Thank you, Council President. In the interest of time, I should just probably make some brief comments, and if you have questions, then I have a PowerPoint ready with pictures and graphics to address the specifics. But it's important, so several things listening to Director Jones speak, it's important to point out several key moments. One being there's a big difference between the International Energy Conservation Code and the International Green Construction Code. While the Energy Conservation Code obviously just addresses energy conservation, the Green Code, just like Director Jones alluded to it, it's an umbrella code, or otherwise known as an overlay. It's a model overlay code, and so it addresses sustainability at every step of the development process, from site design to building material selection to construction, occupancy, operation, maintenance, and beyond. And by sustainability, we don't just mean energy efficiency. We mean all of sustainability: air quality, water quality, urban heat island effect, ecosystem services, the whole package. So it's important not to conflate the two codes together. Now, specifically on the fiscal concerns, DPS did kindly share the JBG analysis with me, and I was looking through it, and some numbers I may not agree with, but a lot of the numbers actually look pretty good. And yes, there is a construction cost premium, but ballpark estimates show that you can have a payback period of 6 years. So in about 6 years, your energy savings and other savings will pay, for the construction period premium, and then for the entire life of the building, those green improvements will continue to generate a return. And it's interesting because the federal figures also say roughly, a 6-year payback period. I have a study here on green roofs, for example. It's a 6-year payback period, and then it generates an internal rate of return of over 5%, for the life of the building. So it's important to think of these improvements not as additional costs, but really an investment, because it has a net present value, it has an internal rate of return, it's an investment. It's not a burden, it's something that the building owner and occupant will receive direct benefit on, and plus the society as a whole will receive ancillary benefit in the form of ecosystem services, etc. As far as our goals with the IgCC, as the Council President mentioned, we did pass a law in 2006, and we do have a climate protection plan, which mandates the energy use reduction by 20% by 2020. And the latest sustainability report that came out in March of this year shows that it's 2015. Instead of decreasing our energy use, we're actually increasing our energy use. So in my discussion with DPS staff, we had the conversation about, well, we need baby steps. The industry needs to adjust. And I understand the logic, but if you look at the greater picture, Germany has been doing green roofs for 50 years. How many decades? Is it going to take a century for us to adjust to green roofs? I mean, France finally mandated green roofs and solar panels on all new construction as a whole country. We're not just a few years behind. We're half a century behind. And one slide, if you could just flip to the first one, that's the International Energy Efficiency Scorecard. The United States is number 13, just ahead of Russia, Brazil, and Mexico. And, I'm from Russia, so I don't want to say anything bad, but I don't want to compete with Russia on energy efficiency. I want to compete with Germany on energy efficiency. And this is Montgomery County. It's a progressive jurisdiction. We have goals to achieve, and we definitely have the resources to do it, and the market and the economy to do it as well. And just wanted to quote the recent address by Pope Francis here. Those who possess more resources and economic or political power seem mostly to be concerned with masking the problems or concealing their symptoms. And that's what I feel is happening to a great extent here in Montgomery County, where there is a lot of talk about environment and conservation and climate change, but so far there hasn't been as much walking as there has been talking. And the IgCC is really a first step in this whole process. It's not really something revolutionary. The approach, the whole point of the overlay model code may be new, but the requirements in it are not revolutionary. And all of these technologies exist already, and it's just a matter of the local jurisdiction requiring them. So I feel like we need to move with the IgCC as soon as possible. It's just a baseline of minimum sustainability requirements. It is, in my opinion, nothing scary. The JBG numbers, to me, they look good, the ones that I agree with. So, and they are backed up by federal studies and international studies and the experience of other countries on moving ahead with all these technologies for half a century now. So I'm here to answer any questions and yield the rest of my time.
Thank you. I'd like to suggest that we have Mr. Bennett present, and then council members can, Ms. Jones, I'd like Mr. Bennett to present, and then there will be an opportunity for crosstalk. I'll call on you to respond to Mr. Shaveiko or Mr. Bennett, and council members, I will have questions, and I anticipate other council members will as well, and then anyone on the panel can jump in and respond when questions arise. But I'd like to call on Mr. Bennett now.
Thank you, and thank you all for inviting me to speak to you. I am heartened by the presentation today, and I'll tell you why. The Potomac Valley chapter of the AIA has been involved with DPS for more than 2 years in reviewing the IgCC for its adoption. I, in fact, wrote a document at one point on how to adopt the IgCC. I think the most important thing here is that we formulated extensive observations about both the IgCC and ASHRAE 189.1. This book says IgCC on the outside, but there's actually another code in here. There is an alternative compliance path, which is an ASHRAE standard. There was a while when people were enthusiastic about that standard, and many still are. It's been widely adopted because it is, in fact, more mandatory than the IgCC. We all need to be mindful that saying something complies with the IgCC is not saying anything, because the IgCC is customizable in dozens of ways. Baltimore has recently adopted, as I understand it, a fairly complete version of the IgCC, and the blowback is enormous. The District of Columbia, on the other hand, adopted another version of the IgCC, which is pretty reasonable and was arrived at through full consensus participation by all users and without controversy. And we got to the point last Labor Day where there was a proposed adoption language for the IgCC that was published by DPS. We had already reviewed both of these standards. We had participated in the public hearings from last summer, which were generated around what was essentially